right, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Schools. So excited to be here with Trisha, and our special guest today was Dr. Offner, who Trisha is going to talk to us a little bit about. But today we get into the mental health of schools as well as the mental health of students. Trisha, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Happy New Year, Jeff. I really like that we're kicking off the new year with this as our topic and thinking about, taking care of ourselves, taking care of our community, and getting some real guidance around what that means. Dr. Offner is going to talk to us a little bit about how important it is to listen, how important it is to be clear. And that really resonated with me. She kind of talks about just, if you were in crisis mode, Jeff, I shouldn't just assume what it is that you would need, but let's have a conversation and learn exactly what you would need in that scenario. It's a real pleasure to be talking with Dr. Deborah Offner, who is an adolescent psychologist who has 25 years of experience working in schools, colleges, and clinical practice. You're going to have links over there in the show notes. She's been in the Boston Globe, Shape, all over the place. She works with adolescents, young adults, and their families in her private practice and consults with middle and secondary schools about student mental health. Her brand new book is titled Educators as First Responders, A Teacher's Guide to Adolescent Development and Mental Health in Grades 6 through 12. And listeners, if you are interested in winning a free copy of that book, we have 2 to give away. You'll learn more about that giveaway when you sign up for our free newsletter, which you can access at www.shiftingschools.com.
Yeah, so make sure you're signed up for the newsletter. We have a great conversation today. Everything from the mental health of your schools, how are we taking care of each other as an educational community of adults? And then we get into what does that look like for students today and supporting students' mental health, as we know that this is something that many teachers are dealing with right now. So this is a great episode. Before we get over to that interview, a quick word from today's show sponsor. A huge shout out to our sponsor, Money Pickle, for supporting our podcast. If you're new to the education profession, first of all, welcome. And now that you're here, have you thought about your financial future as you embark on this rewarding career? Money Pickle offers complimentary financial assistance where you can speak with experienced advisors to guide you through investing, saving, and planning for your future. Start your teaching journey with financial confidence. Thanks to Money Pickle, head to moneypickle.com/shifting schools today to sign up for a complimentary, no obligation video call with a financial advisor that is picked right for you. That's moneypickle.com/shifting schools. Get your finances in order and reach out to Money Pickle today. That again is moneypickle.com/shifting schools. All right. And with that, here is Dr. Deborah Offner, PhD, talking about mental health in both our schools and with students. And with that, on with the show.
We are honored to be kicking off our mini-series on mental health with you because you have such a wealth of experience advising educational institutions on sustaining emotionally healthy schools. And we think actually it might be great just to start there with kind of like a basic grounding on what an emotionally healthy school is, and maybe even talk a little bit about what it isn't.
Yeah, that's great. So an emotionally healthy school, for me, starts with the adults. Because if the adults aren't healthy, and by that, I don't mean that they have work-life balance. I don't mean that, they're well compensated necessarily. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an environment where adults feel like they have some autonomy, some input into important decisions that are made, or at the very least, that there's some transparency when decisions are made that may not include faculty or staff input, that people can be told, this is what we considered, these were the factors we weighed, and this is why we're doing X instead of Y. I think one of the biggest complaints I get from teachers is that they're not in the loop and that they don't know why things are happening and that they don't have input. So I think adult communication is important, and that runs the gamut from systemic issues and decision making, like I said, to also like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging issues, in the sense that if you want a school where the kids feel like their identities are respected and understood, the adults have to be able to have conversations with each other about those things, in order for them to then support the kids in those ways. So there's a lot of like parallel process where if you want the kids to feel supported, you've got to support the adults. And some of that is free yoga classes or a raise or, a babysitting voucher or something like that. But a lot of it is talking and communicating.
I really appreciate that. It reminds me of I saw a study recently about what's kind of popularly known as the feedback sandwich, where it's like, if I had to give you some
Compliment
tough
sandwich,
feedback,
yeah.
like, oh, actually, Dr. Offner, like, what a beautiful smile you have. By the way, here's this bad news. And also, did I mention your smile's great? And the research talks about like, don't do that. Like when you have to give feedback or you have to have a difficult conversation, like actually the transparency piece and kind of like trust
Yeah.
your conversation partner, like, treat adults as valuable assets, which
Yeah.
I feel like is what you're getting at there too.
100%, because I think as the adults who work in schools, we know the kids are valuable assets and it's our job to make them feel like that. But a lot of times that can get lost when it comes to how you treat adults. So if you're a school leader, you want to remember that you have power, you have authority, and adults are vulnerable also. I think the COVID-19 pandemic kind of showed us that in bold relief, just how vulnerable the adults are.
Yeah. And of course, in
Yeah.
schools, we're vulnerable adults. We've got very vulnerable students, and your book is a real asset. I'd love to just quote from it for a moment. And again, listeners, remember, hang in there until the end to learn a little bit more about an opportunity to win a giveaway. From your book, quoting you directly here, quote, virtually none of us is trained in how to respond to crisis, at least not routinely, but sticking to some basic tenets can provide purpose and direction as you are called upon to help students and families in your midst. The job here mostly comes down to listening. Dr. Offner, can you talk more to us about this idea and maybe just unpack a little bit of one of the tenets that you recommend, and this idea of listening and how that's kind of the anchor here? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think as a trained child psychologist, I know that listening is one of the most important interventions I do. It's the crux of any session I have with a student. Um, I think what I know as a human and as someone who's worked in schools and with many kids is that most people don't necessarily have the experience of being really fully listened to by someone who is trying to understand them. That's why adolescent therapy is so rapidly effective, because when you have a therapist who can do that, that in and of itself is an intervention. So I think in a crisis or in a moment where you're like, I can't believe this kid just dropped this in my lap, or I can't believe this parent just called and told me X. I'm not a therapist. I don't know what to do. I'm a math teacher. If you can listen and view your role as simply being present, physically, emotionally, staying steady and taking in information and gathering data about what these people are going through or might need, not necessarily just from you, but from your school, that in and of itself makes a huge difference. And you don't necessarily have to do a lot more than that. The other thing that my book encourages people to do is to call on colleagues, whatever their domain, for the kinds of expertise and help that you might need, whether it's a counselor, whether it's an academic administrator, that you don't have to solve it and you don't have to fix it or even know what needs to be done, but you can connect people to services and other people.
Are there specific questions, or like, I'm just trying to put myself in back in the classroom when these situations happened, when you're trying to gather information, because I think that's a really good way to put it. You're listening to somebody, and just allowing them to be heard. Are there from a teacher perspective, are there specific questions or even question stems that we could be thinking about to support people just being able to know that we are listening and that we're hearing them?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can ask people to just organize or frame their thoughts. So saying something
Mm.
like, what's your foremost concern here? what's the thing that you feel the school could help with the most? Sometimes I'll ask a kid, what's your worst worry here? Like, what's your worst case scenario in terms of what you're telling me? And can you sort of just let me know so that I get a sense of where you're coming from and what you're sort of living with? There's a middle school counselor that I work with a lot down in Florida who's really lovely. And often what she says to a kid is after they, come into her office and they're, talking about friend drama or some other, even more upsetting thing in their life, she'll just kind of sit back and take it in and then say, how can I help? And often kids will have, something that they can volunteer for a way that she could be helpful.
And do you find a lot of times it's not a big thing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times with kids, it's little things. You asked my history teacher if I could get an extension, for 2 days. Some of these kids, they're so hyper conscientious or worried about their grade or making a bad impression on adult. That there's a lot we can do as adults in schools that, like, we actually have a fair amount of power. As a counselor, I can get kids out of something, not that I want to abuse it or have them sort of exploit it, but often they're so relieved that you can just do this little thing for them. You're right. Yeah.
I'm wondering.
Yeah. My wife is a school counselor for 20 years. And I think that was always one of her greatest gifts as well, as, kids knew they could come to her and she could, quote unquote, get them out of something.
It's super.
She's not getting them out of anything. It's going to just talking with the teacher and saying, hey, this kiddo's having a hard time with this or whatever. Because, in education, educators are just, we want to help kids, and whatever that means and whatever that is. But I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes down to actually listening to what they feel they need to be supported.
Yeah.
And listening is such a critical skill. Sorry, Trish, I cut you off.
No problem. No, I was just, thinking the advice that you're giving, Jeff's right. Teachers want to support the students, but I think also teachers want to support one another. And I'm wondering if you feel like there's a significant overlap between that advice you have for a teacher supporting a student in a crisis and the reality. My wife is a school leader. Fairly recently, one of her teachers had a spouse pass away and, was really thinking about what is it going to mean for me to support my colleague, really in the really for the rest of the year. And I'm wondering, it's this idea of a crisis. It's not limited just to the students, but it's our colleagues. It's a whole community, right? So, do you think it's sort of this advice really applies more broadly, or would you make any adjustments to what you're suggesting we can do for one another in a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is the same. Obviously, like the details of it are different, but I think, I also at the school where I work had a colleague lose a really close young family member, this fall as well. I mean, it certainly happens. I think, definitely listening, definitely picking up on what an adult's boundaries are, and I mean, the same goes for kids, right? I mean, there's some adults who are going to want an ear and want someone to talk to and want to share. And there's other people who are like, I just need to come in, do my job and go home and grieve, so it's like kind of picking up on what it is that they need, not expecting them to do anything performative in terms of talking or sharing, but letting them know you're there. Also offering practical support, the getting them out of things. If someone is dealing with a loss, and it would just help them, can we take something off your plate? Is there some administrative task or some meeting you were supposed to lead that we could just make things a little bit less demanding for you here? I think, as I'm sure your wife knows, that goes a long way too. And not everybody feels comfortable asking, or they don't even know that's what they need.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that boundary advice thing, I like, as I've gotten older, I feel like I've almost learned through failure about that. Like, check first, don't assume what I need is what somebody else would need. So for maybe a younger school leader who's listening and is thinking, I love what Dr. Offner just said about, like, yes, respect that person's boundaries. But if you don't know, what are some good ways to ask? Like, do you have a way of framing that conversation so I'm not operating on this assumption, even though this is what I would want, I'm not going to impose that on you. How do you do that investigation of finding out what the other person needs?
Yeah, I think, again, to be super transparent, I mean, I could see a conversation where you say, I think if I were in your situation, I might want to, talk after work and go out for drinks for like 3 nights in a row and just, I don't know if that's what you want. If it is, I'm happy to join you. But what do you think, what can I do or what can we, our colleagues do that would be most helpful? And then, it's sort of in saying what you would want, but acknowledging they might not want it, it opens up the possibility that there's no wrong answer and that you're
Mm.
really looking to like, is there anything we can do to support you right now? I think that goes such a long way. I think a lot of people also in the face of something like a loss, that you're describing, they don't know what to say. And they
Mm.
feel sort of awkward. And so some people avoid the person, some people overshare their own experiences, but I think, I mean, again, as a therapist, asking questions is always a good way to go in.
Mm. I like that. And around the idea of appropriate boundaries, I mean, we're hearing from teachers all over the place about just mental health with students today.
Right.
And I think there's this idea of just helping teachers who are struggling with what are the appropriate boundaries around necessary support when students are facing mental health.
Yep.
And so, how can educators kind of balance their professional responsibilities that I am your teacher, I'm here to teach you math, I'm your math teacher, but at the same time, have that emotional aspect of supporting student well being? How do you kind of support teachers, or any thoughts about helping teachers kind of with those appropriate boundaries of, I want to be your friend and I want you to know that I'm here for you.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm your teacher and we've got a job to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, in a way, even the idea of being a friend, like as much as it may feel that way, like you're not,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if kids think you are, want you to be, pretend you are, and that doesn't mean you can't be super close and connected and caring. And I think, all of us have different personal boundaries. So just like the example with grief where everyone deals with differently, some of us, well, I shouldn't put myself because I'm obviously a psychologist, but some teachers love being that emotional support person. And they
Yeah.
love, for example, my old school, the ceramics teacher was just this amazing woman. And, kids would come into her studio and they'd be throwing pots and who knows what they would bring up, but she would often
Right.
come running down the hall of my office and say, this kid just brought this up while they were throwing a wheel. What do I do?
Yeah.
So some people love being in that role and other people, like, they don't want to know, like, you have a mental health
Yeah.
issue, like, here's the counselor's, office
Yeah.
location, like, goodbye. So I think you have to, like, any of those are fine. Like, it's fine to be really open and connected and want to hear about a kid's weekend. It's also fine to not.
Mm.
I think the problem that I see with boundaries and teachers and student mental health is that it's a slippery slope where a
Mm.
kid might confide in you after class that they're going through a rough time. And then the next thing you know, you're getting an email at midnight that they're feeling like suicidal, So,
Right.
so I always encourage, again, as a psychologist, teachers to refer whenever you can. It's not that if a kid starts crying about a quiz grade, you have to send them to the counselor. But if you
Yeah.
sense that there are mental health issues or you start to learn that there are, to try to, do you have you ever been to a therapist? Oh, you already have a therapist. Oh, okay.
Mm.
How, how's that going? Do your parents know, to kind of bring other adults in, even to in the conversation with a student, so that you're not the only one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say we're very fortunate here in the state of Washington that we now have school counselors in every school,
Right. Yeah.
to support that. And I wish that was the way all everywhere in the world, and especially here in the US. And I know it's not, but,
Right.
that ability to be able to lean on somebody, or know that you have somebody backing you up as a teacher
Yeah.
that is a trained professional, school counselor, psychologist, somebody else that you can lean on to support these kiddos. I think it's critical as well. So, and besides that, who would be your next part if you don't have a school counselor, if you don't have a psychologist that's there every day because they're only there one every 5 days or whatever
Totally.
school's set up? Is it an administrator? Like,
Yeah. So
what's
I
your
think,
recommendation?
every school is so different, but there's
Yeah.
often an administrator that is a student support person.
Right.
Either by training or by personality, like sometimes in a school, there's just someone that's like a good, wise go-to. Maybe they've been there for 30 years and they've seen everything. So always you want to be conferring with someone else if you have a real concern about a student. The other thing I say too is, don't forget, especially those of us that are working at the high school level, that students have parents. I think it's really easy especially because kids often forget that they have a parent, or that's not who they're that's not who
Right.
their go-to. Although a lot of kids it is.
Yeah.
But to remember that there is another adult, in most cases, someone who is responsible for that kid's well-being and may love them deeply and actually have a lot to offer. And so to just kind of gently inquire to find out what that relationship is like, and if the parent is a resource.
Yeah,
love that.
I appreciate you bringing that up. It reminds me of, I'm seeing more great school leaders do some surveying to get a sense of, do you have a trusted adult in your personal life? Do you
Yeah,
have at least one
yeah,
teacher here at school you feel you could speak to make sure, they kind of have that profile? I think that's
yes.
really great, especially, if there is a crisis situation. For school leaders who are thinking, maybe we need to ask some better questions at the beginning of the year or to check in so we
Mhm.
have a sense of what the support network is. Um, as an adolescent psychologist, is there any other sort of question asking or curiosity or data that you think school leaders should be going after to get a sense that's going to help them better support student well being?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's things you can learn. I mean, like you said, whether they have a trusted adult, who would you go to if, you were in a crisis? I would want to know, and maybe you said this, do you have a parent or caregiver that you can rely on if something were to happen? I would also want to know, as a school leader, how many of my kids and families are engaged with mental health professionals outside of school. That's just an important data point in terms of how much are kids accessing therapy? Because in some communities, it's incredibly common. And it would be good to know if half the kids in ninth grade have their own therapist, or if nobody does, and if they do or don't, why is that? Are people in a situation where they can't afford it or nobody has time available? That would be important to know. It might affect your ideas about potential staffing or, accessing additional resources. Or again, if a lot of kids are connected, that could become a go-to as well for kids with issues, that, a lot of these families can get their own support outside of school. Maybe we can sort of help people to do that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, like your
I love
thoughts.
that.
Jeff does so much work around some generational differences. And so I think this is another area,
Yeah,
like for my parents, and I know my dad wouldn't mind me sharing this anecdote, like
yeah,
retiring, getting older is difficult for years. Like I'm of a generation that very much kind of thinks like therapy is very useful. There's not as much of a stigma. For my parents' generation, there was a lot of discomfort around that. So it took, I would almost say, like years of a campaign. And now,
yeah,
I think he's sort of realizing, yes, it's just like when I have to go get physical therapy, right? It's the mind body connection, all of that. So I'm sort of wondering, for your thoughts in terms of, do you get the sense that that stigma is being broken down, or are you still having to do that kind of conversation piece with parents, caregivers, teachers?
yeah. That's a great question. It depends who the people are. So
Mhm.
I'd say, like, overall, I mean, Generation Z is very, therapy savvy. They've got TikToks about it. They're seeing therapists on TikTok. The kids, I mean, so yeah, today's kids are very open to therapy. Every kid I know is, and I don't only know kids through my practice, I know kids through schools. Parents are a mixed bag. And part of it is culture and background.
Yeah.
So I would say that there's plenty of cultures in the world, then some of those families are here in the US for 3 years or 20 years, depending on when they came, where it's really not the sort of typical thing that we see with the American culture about therapy. So, with some Asian or Asian American families, though by no means all, there's still a lot of stigma, even not in the kids, but in the parents who are in their 30s or 40s. Um, some African cultures, the parents, it's mental health just isn't, it's almost like not conceptually relevant. Like it's not, and so, kids will say to me who are in high school or college, yeah, my parents, like, mental health isn't a thing in my parents' culture. So
Yeah.
I think it really does depend on almost more the cultural background than the age, but on the whole, Today's kids are all about therapy, and they don't even blink an eye a lot of times. They don't seem to feel stigma about it.
Yeah. And I would probably second that, just with my wife being, again, a school counselor for 20 years and working internationally for 10 of those,
Yeah.
with all these different cultures. A lot of times it was spending time with the parents to understand what does a school counselor do, because of as soon as they heard that their child was talking to a school counselor, it was like, you're not allowed to talk to my child. And it even was just breaking down okay, I'm just talking to your child. They're not in therapy. We're just having conversations about grades or where they're feeling stressed. And a lot of it was, I agree with you. I think there's probably more cultural stigma than there is generational stigma. And there still is generational stigma for sure, Trisha. I mean, my dad would have been exactly the same way. There's just no way you would have ever got him to go see a mental health person, right?
Right.
But I do find it that I agree with you. I think that it's probably more culturally, like being culturally aware that it's not every culture sees it the same way. Yeah. But I think what we are doing, I mean, you can say whatever you want about social media, but I do think this is one place where social media has supported a generation when they are seeing, and kids are openly, and you mentioned TikTok, openly on TikTok saying, I'm getting help.
Yes.
And when you see other kids your own age saying publicly, I'm getting help, it's okay for you to get help too. We are breaking down those stigmas for a generation. So I find that really interesting as well.
Right. That's a beautiful thing. I agree.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Some beautiful things of social media. It's not all bad out there.
Well, that's maybe
the way these kids share.
That's maybe a nice segue to, of course, link to your new book in the show notes, but you've been in the Boston Globe, Shape, Care, sort of all over the place. For listeners who are maybe checking out some of your work and thinking, Dr. Offner's got like some great stuff. We'd love to have her work with our district or school. What's the best way for folks to reach out to you to maybe explore options to learn further, or to do a book club perhaps with you in 2024?
Yeah, totally. That's exactly the kind of thing I love to do. So my website, so it's www.deborahOffner.phd.com. Or if you Google me and just write Deborah Offner PhD, I will come up with the website. There is an famous actress with my same exact name and spelling. And so you will get two sets of pictures. And I'll just say that hers are, far more dazzling than mine. But you'll find me easily, but you'll also see that she has a whole bunch of movies that she's been in. Yeah.
So you're not the movie one.
I'm not the movie one. I am not. I don't live in New York on Central Park the way that she does.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fun doppelganger to have for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your advice. Really enjoyed your book. And again, like continuing to think, what is an emotionally healthy school? I think that's a great question for us to kick off the new year with.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, and thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much.